On a snowy New Year's Eve, a small boy named Noah appears alone in the town square, holding only a mysterious piece of paper with half-written lyrics to a forgotten song. His silent presence rekindles old rivalries and long-buried griefs, drawing the divided townspeople together. As midnight approaches and the church bell tolls for the first time in decades, buried secrets are revealed and old wounds begin to heal. Will the town overcome its painful past to embrace a new beginning? And why did this boy, unable to speak, arrive on this night with a message that could either unite or divide them once more? The cold pressed against the town of Willow Creek with an insistence that cut deeper than the night's wind. Strings of lights dangled across storefronts and crooked lampposts, blinking weakly as if caught in a tired dance. People hurried past, faces shadowed beneath hats and scarves, too consumed by their own stories to notice the boy who stood barefoot in the snow, a tattered coat doing little to shield his trembling form. Noah was small, his skin flushed with a pink tinge from the frost. His dark, unkempt curls clung to his forehead, half-covered eyes wide with something that was not quite fear, but close enough to draw a second glance. He said nothing. He hadn't since he'd wandered into the square at twilight, but he clutched a crumpled piece of paper in his tiny hand, fingers red with cold. When an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a cane as sturdy as her presence halted mid-stride, it was as if time itself paused for just a moment. "Child, where's your mother?" Mrs. Thompkins's voice cracked, both stern and softened by a tremor she hadn't felt in years. She leaned down, searching his face for a story. Noah said nothing. He only looked at her, and then at the sky, where clouds hovered, pregnant with snow. Others stopped now, drawn by Mrs. Thompkins's rare show of concern. Mr. Harris, with his shoulders hunched like a vulture's, shuffled closer, squinting with suspicion. He had once owned the town's only grocer, now shuttered and as broken as the window panes in the old chapel. Behind him, Eliza, the schoolteacher whose fall from grace years ago still whispered its way through back doors, stood hesitant, her gloved hand twitching at her side. "Is he yours?" Mr. Harris's voice was rough, accusatory, and it pricked the silence like a thorn. "No," Eliza said, the word fragile. Her eyes, deep with shadows only she knew, locked onto Noah's small, frozen frame. "But he looks like he needs help." A murmur rippled through the gathering, the crowd swelling with whispers and fragmented questions. Noah did not flinch. His grip on the paper only tightened, creasing it further. The light from the lamppost flickered once, casting their faces in a sudden, uncertain glow. Mrs. Thompkins reached out, fingers stiff from age, to touch the boy's hand. His skin felt like ice. He did not pull away. Mrs. Thompkins turned to the crowd, her eyes hardening as she spoke. "Well, don't just stand there gawking. The boy needs warmth, not a spectacle." She tried to infuse her tone with the authority she once wielded when her voice was respected in the town's council meetings. Eliza stepped forward, the slight tremor in her movements hidden beneath the thick folds of her coat. "I can take him to my house," she said quietly. A murmur rose from the crowd, surprise mixed with something more bitter. Eliza had become an outlier, her name often paired with words like disgrace and reckless. Yet now, as she stood before the child, her gaze softened into a tenderness she hadn't shown since the day she lost her own daughter. Mr. Harris shifted uncomfortably, scuffing his boots against the icy cobblestones. "You sure that's wise, Eliza?" He narrowed his eyes, suspicion warring with something reluctant in his expression. His gaze flicked to the paper in Noah's grasp. The corner of it, marked with what looked like an old inked letter, caught the glint of the streetlight. "What's that he's holding?" Noah's eyes darted between the adults, wary but unafraid. The wind howled in response, and a few snowflakes began their descent, dotting his hair like little frozen stars. The boy finally let go of Mrs. Thompkins's hand, opening his small fist to reveal the crumpled paper. Eliza took a step closer, her breath visible in the freezing air as she crouched to meet his level. "May I see, sweetheart?" she whispered, the term slipping out as naturally as it once had years ago when her own daughter tugged at her skirts. Noah's dark eyes locked on hers, searching for trust, and after a long heartbeat, he nodded. She took the paper gingerly, unfurling it as if it might dissolve with touch. The writing was smudged, lines trailing off where ink had been smeared, but the script itself was unmistakable to those who remembered. Gasps resonated from the back of the gathering. It was the same handwriting that appeared on the old hymn books used during the town's long-abandoned blessing of light ceremonies, a tradition cut short by a fire that claimed too much, too fast. "It can't be," Mrs. Thompkins breathed, eyes wide with a fear laced with awe. The whispers grew, disjointed pieces of a shared memory seeping into the present. The legend spoke of a child appearing during times of greatest division, silent but carrying a message that would spark unity or deepen discord. Eliza glanced up at Noah, his gaze unwavering, then back at the paper, where half-formed words hinted at a familiar verse, part hymn, part plea. "It's a song," she said, more to herself than the others. Mr. Harris drew closer. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time in years his voice trembled. Could it really be? Noah, still silent, reached for her hand, as if to pull her toward something unseen. Eliza's heart thudded beneath her coat, and she followed his lead. The crowd, curiosity and ancient fears mingling in their chests, followed behind like shadows chasing the last flickers of light. The snow deepened as Eliza led Noah away from the square, the crowd trailing in a muted procession. The child's tiny hand, warmer now in hers, anchored her to the present. They arrived at her modest home at the edge of the town, a small, weathered cottage framed by frost-dappled windows and a wooden porch that creaked underfoot. Inside, the air warmed instantly with the crackle of a modest fire. Eliza removed Noah's coat, revealing thin, patched clothing beneath. Her heart clenched at the sight. Memories of a similar winter flooding back when her daughter, Emily, had giggled by this very hearth, cheeks flushed with life. Pushing the pain aside, she settled Noah on a chair, wrapping a woolen blanket around him. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said more than words ever could. Trust, fleeting and fragile. Mr. Harris hovered by the doorway, hat in hand, eyes darting about as if unsure of where he belonged. His usually hard features softened as he watched Noah take slow, careful sips of warm broth Eliza pressed into his small hand. "Look at the paper again," he finally said, breaking the silence that had settled between the three of them. Eliza nodded, setting the bowl aside to unfold the crumpled slip. This time she laid it flat on the table, smoothing it with tender fingers. The writing was clearer now under the warm light. The incomplete verse spoke of light amidst the darkness and a gathering of souls bound by hope. An ache spread through Eliza as she recognized the lyrics. It was part of the song she used to sing during the Blessing of Light, a ceremony that united the town until the fire that took so many lives, including her Emily's, consumed their unity. Mrs. Thompkins appeared at the window, her face lined with worry and hope. She rapped gently on the glass before letting herself in. "I couldn't just stay away," she said, breathless from the cold. Her eyes fell on Noah, who met her gaze with that unwavering stare. "That song, it was believed to bring people together. My grandmother used to say that if it ever appeared again, it would mean salvation or division." A weight fell over the room, heavy with the burden of forgotten promises and silenced griefs. Eliza felt it settle deep in her bones. She looked at Mr. Harris, who stood still as stone, his eyes distant. "You remember, don't you?" she asked softly. He didn't respond at first, his fingers tightening around his hat. "I remember," he admitted, voice gravelly. His wife had been among those who perished in the fire. Their argument that morning had been their last exchange. He'd carried that guilt like a stone ever since. Noah's hand brushed against Eliza's, his eyes speaking an unspoken truth. It wasn't just a song, it was a call. "We need to gather everyone," Mrs. Thompkins declared. "Tonight, before midnight." Mr. Harris's eyes flared with an old, forgotten energy. "It's too late for that," he muttered, though his tone hinted at something less certain. Eliza shook her head, a stubborn determination rising in her chest. "No, it isn't," she said, standing taller. "This boy came for a reason. We have to believe that." Noah's eyes sparkled with something close to recognition, as if he understood the weight of her words. The snowstorm swirled outside, thickening as words spread through the town. One by one, reluctant faces emerged from their homes, cloaked in wool and doubt, drawn by whispers of the silent boy and the torn song he carried. The town square, once a place of murmured suspicion, pulsed with a hesitant energy as the clock inched toward midnight. Eliza stood at the center, Noah's small hand clasped in hers. Mrs. Thompkins, her cane digging into the packed snow, stood beside them, her chin held high as if daring the wind to oppose her. Mr. Harris, his stooped figure now rigid with purpose, positioned himself by the bell tower, where remnants of the fire-blackened wood still held the weight of tragedy. The townsfolk clustered in uneven circles, eyes darting between each other with the unspoken question, why now? Why this boy? And why tonight? The older ones exchanged glances, recognizing the song's history, their breath visible in the freezing air. From the crowd, a voice broke the silence. Is this a joke? It was Peter Malloy, a farmer known for his skepticism. His eyes narrowed as he met Eliza's gaze. What are we doing here, gathered in the cold for an old song and a stranger's child? Before Eliza could answer, Noah stepped forward, the blanket slipping from his shoulders. He held the paper up, its edges fluttering like fragile wings in the wind. His dark eyes swept across the crowd, pleading without a sound. Then, with a small, trembling hand, he pointed to the bell tower, a symbol now scarred by grief and silence. A murmur passed through the crowd as realization set in. The bell hadn't rung since that fateful night. To ring it was to confront what had been lost and acknowledge the pain that divided them. Mr. Harris, whose hands had not touched the bell's rope since the day his wife died, stepped forward. His face was drawn with years of sorrow and loneliness, but determination sparked in his eyes. He looked at Eliza, their shared losses stitching an invisible thread between them. I'll do it, he said, his voice strong yet trembling. Before anyone could protest, he reached for the frayed rope, its fibers rough against his palms. The wind stilled for a moment, and a deep collective breath seemed to pass through the crowd. Then, with a heave that sent shivers through his spine, Mr. Harris pulled. The sound that followed was not the ghostly, hollow chime they expected. It was deep and resonant, echoing through the streets and across the frosted rooftops, drawing gasps from those gathered. For a heartbeat, it was as though the town itself exhaled, releasing years of pent-up grief and silence. The bell's toll brought with it a warmth, subtle and pulsing, as if each note carried a heartbeat. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes as she turned to Noah, who now looked at her with something close to joy, a soft smile breaking his solemn expression. Around them, the crowd shifted, no longer separate but drawn closer by the bell's call. Sing, Mrs. Thompkins whispered, her voice thick. It wasn't a command, but a plea, and as if carried on an old, cherished wind, Eliza began, her voice raw and trembling. The first note wavered before finding strength, and soon others joined, hesitant at first, then bold. The song flowed through them, resurrecting memories of hands once held, laughter shared, and lives intertwined. The words, familiar yet distant, resonated with a message of light and forgiveness. And as the final verse fell into the cold air, Noah stepped into the center, turning to face the crowd with eyes that seemed far older than his years. The last toll of the bell echoed, and silence fell once more. This time, it was not the silence of absence, but of recognition. A shared understanding settled like snowflakes upon the town, brittle and soft, but capable of holding weight. Eliza's voice broke, but she whispered words only Noah could hear. You brought us back, and he nodded, the first tear rolling down his cheek. A shiver coursed through the crowd as Noah's tear traced its path down his cheek, glistening under the pale moonlight. The final chime of the bell resonated in the crisp night, seeming to settle into the bones of everyone present. For a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped spinning. Eyes met, hearts softened, and old, stubborn walls within them began to crumble. Suddenly, a commotion stirred at the edge of the square. A man and woman, bundled in thick coats and scarves, pushed their way forward. Their faces were flushed, eyes wild with fear and hope. The woman let out a gasp that turned heads, her hand flying to her mouth as she locked eyes with Noah. "Noah!" she called, voice cracking with both joy and desperation. The crowd parted, creating a path between mother and son. Noah stood still for a beat, as if processing the sight before him. Then, with an abruptness that sent a fresh wave of emotion through the gathered townsfolk, he broke into a run. The woman dropped to her knees, arms outstretched, and caught him as he barreled into her embrace. They clung to each other, sobs echoing through the silence. The man, taller and broad-shouldered with eyes as tired as the moon, joined them, wrapping them both in his embrace. "We thought we'd lost you," he whispered, the words barely carrying over the soft, stunned murmurs of the crowd. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but she turned her gaze away, a bittersweet ache spreading through her chest. This was the reunion she had once prayed for, but fate had not been so kind to her. Still witnessing it now, the joy in Noah's eyes and the relief in his parents' expressions softened the sharp edges of her sorrow. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, a noise rough with emotion. "Looks like the boy brought more than just a song with him," he muttered. For the first time, a slight smile tugged at his lips. Mrs. Thompkins nodded slowly, eyes misted with unshed tears. "A reminder, perhaps," she said, glancing at the crowd, "that we've been looking for the wrong things for far too long." Eliza stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Noah's mother's shoulder. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice calm but full of urgency. The woman took a shuddering breath, brushing snow from Noah's curls. "We were passing through on our way to my mother's. Our car broke down on the outskirts, and when we went to get help, Noah must have wandered off. We've been searching ever since." The man spoke, his voice gravelly with exhaustion. "We thought we'd never find him." He looked at Eliza and the gathered townsfolk, his eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you, all of you." Before anyone could respond, the sound of a crackling branch drew their attention to the far side of the square. A tall figure, shrouded in the shadows of the old bell tower, stepped forward. His boots crunched in the snow, and he walked with a limp, the heavy coat on his back torn at the hem. "Is that?" someone whispered from the crowd. The man's face emerged into the lantern light, revealing deep-set eyes and a scar that ran jagged across his brow. Recognition shot through the gathering like a current. It was Thomas Hale, the hermit who had disappeared after the fire that had taken so many, including his own family. Rumors had whispered that he'd gone mad, living in the hills beyond the town. But now, here he stood, eyes fixed on Noah. He approached, his gait slow and uncertain, and then spoke, voice hoarse as if unused for years. "The boy," he said, pausing as the words seemed to sap his strength. "He found what we all lost, our light." A stunned silence followed. Then, the old bell let out one final, unexpected chime, softer but insistent, as if echoing Thomas's words. The crowd shifted, faces no longer marked by doubt or fear, but by something deeper, hope reborn. Eliza looked at Thomas, then at the family reunited before her. "Perhaps this was never just about a song," she whispered, eyes meeting Thomas's, and in the silence that followed, Willow Creek felt whole for the first time in decades. Thomas's presence pulled a deeper silence over the square, the kind that hummed with untold stories and unhealed wounds. Eliza's heart thudded in her chest as she met the gaze of the man who had once been the town's most vibrant spirit before grief carved its way into him. His scar, stark and pale under the flickering lantern light, spoke of battles fought in the shadows of his own mind. Thomas took a step closer, eyes fixed on Noah with an intensity that made the boy press closer to his mother's side. "Forgive me," he rasped, turning to face the crowd. His voice was cracked and halting, like a bridge trembling under the weight of too many memories. "For hiding when you needed me." A murmur swept through the townsfolk, surprise mingled with a long-held bitterness that had lingered since the fire. Eliza glanced at Mr. Harris, whose jaw clenched as old anger warred with the empathy beginning to thaw in his expression. "We all lost something that night," Thomas continued, voice wavering. His eyes flitted to Eliza, who stood with her chin high, despite the glisten of tears that threatened to spill. Some of us lost ourselves. I thought if I buried it, hid from the light, I'd be spared the pain of remembering. The crowd shifted, the rawness of his confession palpable. Mrs. Thompkins's usual sternness softened, her grip on her cane loosening. It was never about forgetting, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. It was about holding on to what we still have. Noah, small and silent, stepped forward again. He turned to Thomas and reached out, his tiny fingers brushing the rough fabric of the older man's coat. It was a simple act, innocent and profound, and it sent a ripple through the crowd. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, eyes glistening as he stepped beside Thomas. "We blamed you, Tom," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "We blamed you because we couldn't face our own grief, but I see now that it wasn't just you who lost a family that night. We all lost part of ours." A stunned silence followed, broken only by the sound of snow crunching as people shifted closer to one another, seeking warmth not just from the cold, but from years of silent suffering. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Noah, who now held Thomas's hand, and then at the faces around her, faces once etched with division now softened by the shared burden of memory. The song's words echoed in her mind, a hymn of hope and unity that felt tangible once more. Thomas's eyes met hers, a glimmer of the man he used to be breaking through the scars. "You sang the song tonight," he said, voice quivering with something close to reverence. "And this boy, he brought it back when we'd all but forgotten." A collective exhale seemed to pass through the square. The townspeople stood closer now, no longer scattered but gathered, drawn together by an unseen thread. The air warmed, not from the fire or the glow of lanterns, but from a light that had been dormant in their hearts for far too long. The church bell, cold and still for decades, tolled again, a softer, hopeful note that resonated deep within each soul present. Thomas's hand found Eliza's, a tentative, shaky hold that spoke more than words could. The past was still there, but for the first time, so was the promise of something beyond it. Noah's parents looked on, their eyes wet with gratitude and something else. Hope, fragile, but alive. In that moment, as the last note of the bell faded into the night and the stars blinked through the thinning clouds, Willow Creek felt the stirrings of something it had almost forgotten. Unity, fragile as frost, but enduring in its quiet beauty. The crowd lingered in the square, unmoving as the echoes of the bell's final chime seemed to settle deep into their hearts. It was as if the weight of years, once as heavy as the winter snow, had been lifted just enough to let the warmth of understanding seep through. Thomas Hale's hand, rough and shaking, remained in Eliza's as they stood side by side, eyes locked on the boy who had brought them all together. Noah looked up at them, eyes bright despite the cold. For the first time, he let out a sound, a small, breathy laugh, almost as if he understood the magnitude of the moment. It resonated through the crowd like a gentle breeze, loosening taut shoulders and melting the ice that had clung to their expressions for so long. Noah's parents knelt beside him, hugging him tightly, as if they could keep the moment preserved forever. His mother's voice, soft but full of emotion, spoke over his curls. "Thank you for keeping him safe and for bringing us here." Eliza nodded, the ache in her chest shifting to something bittersweet but bearable. "He brought us all back to where we needed to be," she replied, eyes drifting to Thomas, who was looking at the boy with a mixture of gratitude and awe. Mr. Harris, who had been silent, stepped forward, his old boots crunching in the snow. He looked at Eliza and Thomas, then at the faces around him, faces that had once held grudges as deep as winter, but now glistened with the reflection of shared forgiveness. "I think we've all forgotten what it meant to be neighbors, friends," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "But tonight, we remember." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd, nods and murmurs of assent warming the cold air. Old rivalries seemed to melt under the glow of rekindled unity. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years exchanged tentative smiles, then handshakes, and finally embraces. The square became a patchwork of reunion, of whispered apologies and promises renewed. Mrs. Thompkins, usually rigid as an oak, laid a hand on Eliza's shoulder, squeezing it with a rare display of affection. "You always said songs could mend what words alone could not," she said, her voice low and kind. "Maybe you were right after all." Eliza's eyes welled with tears she did not fight. She looked down at Noah, who now rested quietly against his father's chest, eyes drifting shut as the weight of the night and the warmth of safety pulled him into sleep. "Maybe," she whispered, voice thick but full of hope. "Maybe it was always in us, waiting for the right moment." Thomas let out a shaky breath, his eyes cast skyward where the stars had broken through the clouded sky. He closed them, a prayer silent on his lips, for the family he'd lost and the one he had just found again within the town's embrace. Beside him, Mr. Harris extended a hand, and after a beat, Thomas took it, their shared grief folding into something gentler, a promise of new beginnings. The fire in Eliza's hearth cast a glow onto the street, flickering in the windows as the townsfolk began to disperse. The song lingered in the air, the last verse still humming between them, a balm to their weary souls. As midnight slipped into the first breath of a new year, Willow Creek was no longer a town marked by a single tragic night. It was a place bound by something more enduring, unity forged from grief, hope born from loss, and the gentle reminder of a child who reminded them how to listen to the song they all carried within. The square began to empty, but not without laughter, not without quiet tears and promises whispered between neighbors. And as the last of the lanterns flickered out, a new light took its place, brighter and deeper than the one before. Eliza stood with Thomas, watching as Noah's family disappeared down the snow-dusted road, the sound of their voices a melody that faded into the night. She turned to Thomas, whose expression was no longer shadowed but soft, tentative. "To a new beginning," he said, his voice steady but tender. Eliza nodded, the weight on her chest lifting. "To a new beginning," she echoed, feeling at last the warmth that ached not from memory but from hope. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the rooftops, painting the snow with a soft blush, the town of Willow Creek stood changed. The warmth of the night's unity settled like an embrace, each home cradling its own story of reconciliation and renewed hope. In the town square, the last footprints slowly filled with new snow, but their mark on the hearts of those who stood there remained vivid. Eliza lingered by the now silent bell tower, its aged wood soaked in memories of both loss and newfound unity. The paper with the half-written song still rested in her pocket, its edges worn from her touch. She knew it now not just as a remnant of a painful past, but as a promise that voices, when joined, could heal even the deepest wound. Thomas stood beside her, a different man than the one who had come out of the shadows the night before. His face, lined with years of silence, now held a tentative peace. He glanced at Eliza, a question lingering in his eyes. "Will you keep the song alive?" he asked, the words catching in his throat as though afraid to lose them. Eliza turned to him, a gentle smile breaking through the layers of sorrow she had worn for so long. "Yes," she said, the words simple but full of certainty. "It's time." The sound of a distant laugh caught their attention, and they looked to see Mrs. Thompkins guiding a small group of children across the square, pointing out the bell tower and telling them its story. The children's wide eyes reflected the glow of hope, curious and bright. Noah's presence had awakened something that now coursed through every corner of the town, a reminder that stories were meant to be shared, and wounds, however deep, could close if tended with care. Mr. Harris, wrapped in an old scarf, approached with slow but steady steps. He nodded to Thomas and Eliza, an unspoken agreement settling between them. "We should ring the bell again," he said, his voice rough but sure. "At the start of every year." Eliza's eyes softened, and she reached for Thomas's hand, squeezing it gently. "To remember and to hold close what matters," she said. The three of them stood as sentinels of this new chapter, their shared history and shared future no longer at odds. As the sun rose higher, painting gold across the rooftops, the church bell gave one more gentle chime, stirred by a sudden breeze. It echoed through the streets, bouncing off cobblestones and reaching every ear. A few townsfolk paused in their morning chores, smiles appearing unbidden as they listened. It was not a solemn toll of loss, but a note of possibility, of hope. Eliza stepped away from the tower, her heart lighter, and looked at Thomas and Mr. Harris. "We should join the others. The town's story isn't finished yet," she said, the invitation clear. Thomas nodded, a rare smile touching his lips. "No, it isn't." They walked back into the heart of Willow Creek, where laughter and conversation mingled in the frosty air. The path was still new, still tender from the night's revelations, but it was a path they would walk together. As they moved down the street, Eliza caught sight of Noah, his parents close by, his small hand waving to her. She waved back, the warmth of his smile filling her with a hope she hadn't dared believe in. And so, on that New Year's morning, Willow Creek began again, held together by the echoes of a song, the strength of shared sorrow, and the unyielding promise of unity that started with a boy who didn't speak but managed to remind them all how to listen. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more tales of resilience, hope, and the enduring power of community. Share this with someone who believes in second chances and explore our other stories that keep the spirit of kindness alive.